Greetings, weary travelers of the endless night. Tonight, we journey to the moment when the galaxy's fate was scattered to the stars, when 20 perfect suns were stolen from their father's embrace and hurled into the darkness. We speak of the day that changed everything, though few who lived through it understood what they had witnessed. Let your burdens drift away like ships disappearing beyond the horizon, and listen closely as we trace the paths of the lost, of children torn from their cradle before they could know love, and the worlds that would shape them into legends. Our tale begins not with the scattering, but with the perfection that was lost. 20 miracles of creation, each one a fragment of their Father's infinite soul. Chapter 1. The Perfect Sons. I remember finding an old maintenance log in the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, its pages scorched by energies that should not exist in real space. The final entry, written in a hand that shook with more than fear, contained just 7 words. The children are gone. The sky is screaming. The account I'm about to share comes from the personal archives of Malcador the Sigillite, recovered from stasis vaults that had remained sealed for 10,000 years. His words paint a picture of the Emperor's greatest work in its final hours. 20 perfect beings who would have reshaped the galaxy, if only they had been allowed to grow in their Father's presence. The laboratory stretched across chambers that defied conventional architecture, spaces carved from the living rock beneath Terra's Imperial Palace. Here, where no sunlight had ever touched a stone, the Emperor had labored for decades to create his masterwork. 20 gestation pods arranged in a perfect circle, each one housing a miracle of genetic engineering that would serve as the template for humanity's future. Malcador had entered the sanctum that final morning to find the Emperor standing motionless before the 20th pod, his golden features marked by something that might have been sorrow, if such emotions could touch the master of mankind. The Sigillite's account captures a moment of vulnerability that few had ever witnessed. "My lord," Malcador recorded in his journal, appeared diminished in that vast chamber, despite his towering stature and the aura of power that always surrounded him. He stood like a father watching his children sleep. And perhaps that is exactly what he was. Not the Emperor of mankind in that moment, but simply a parent contemplating the futures he had shaped for those he loved. Each pod contained a being that was both human and more than human, carrying within their developing forms aspects of the Emperor's own psychic nature. The first pod held the one who would become the lion, designed to be the perfect strategist, his mind a blade that could cut through any tactical problem. The second contained the child who would be Fulgrim, crafted to embody beauty and perfection in all its forms. I observed him move from pod to pod, Malcador wrote, pausing before each one as if committing every detail to memory. At the 6th pod, he placed his hand against the crystal surface and whispered words in a language I had never heard before. The child within, who would have been Lehman Russ, stirred in his artificial sleep, as if responding to his father's voice. The Emperor's vision for each son was vast and specific. The 7th pod contained Rogel Dorn, engineered to be the perfect defender, a mind that could turn any position into an unbreachable fortress. The 9th held Sanguinius, designed to inspire hope and loyalty in others, his very presence a beacon that could rally armies and lift hearts even in the darkest hours. But it was at the 20th pod that the Emperor lingered longest. Here lay the child who would have been Alpharius, or perhaps Omegon, for even then the 20th Primarch was a mystery wrapped in potential. The Emperor's hand trembled as he touched the surface, and Malcador recorded words that would haunt him for millennia to come. "I have given them everything I am," the Emperor murmured, his voice carrying harmonics of infinite weariness. Each carries a fragment of my soul, a piece of what I hope humanity might become. They are not just weapons or generals, they are my legacy, my children, the proof that we can transcend what we are and become what we should be. The technology that sustained the Primarchs was beyond even the Mechanicum's understanding. Each pod was not merely a life support system but a miniature realm unto itself, where time flowed differently and growth followed patterns that merged science with something approaching artistry. The developing Primarchs existed in a state between waking and dreaming, their consciousness already beginning to form but not yet aware of the vast purposes for which they had been created. Malcador observed the Emperor's ritual of inspection, noting how his master seemed to commune with each unborn son through means that transcended physical proximity. At the 12th pod, containing the child who would become Angron, the Emperor's expression darkened with what appeared to be foreknowledge of suffering to come. At the 17th, housing the future Lorgar, his features showed something that might have been regret. He knew, Malcador wrote in his journal, though I could not comprehend how, that these perfect children would not remain perfect, that the galaxy they would inherit was too vast and cruel to leave any soul unmarked by its passage. Yet he loved them not for what they would become, but for what they were in that moment, pure potential, unlimited by the compromises that reality would force upon them. The final hours before the scattering were marked by an energy that seemed to build in the very stones of the palace. The Emperor's psychic presence, normally controlled to levels that allowed mortal minds to function in his proximity, began to fluctuate with something approaching distress. The custodian guards stationed outside the laboratory reported hearing sounds that had no source, whispers in languages that predated human speech, music that seemed to emerge from the spaces between heartbeats. The Emperor called for additional security protocols that morning, Malcador recorded, sealing the laboratory with wards that had never before been deemed necessary. He spoke of feeling watched, of presences in the warp that had taken notice of his work. When I asked what manner of entities could threaten such a protected space, he gave me a look that I can only describe as parental fear. Those who would steal children from their cribs, he said, simply because they cannot bear the thought of humanity rising above its station. The 20th pod pulsed with energies that made the air itself shimmer like heat haze. Within, the final Primarch stirred with movements that suggested awareness beyond what should have been possible for a developing consciousness. The Emperor placed both hands on the crystal surface and spoke words that Malcador dared not record, a benediction or perhaps a farewell that carried the weight of absolute love. "My sons," the Emperor whispered, and his words seemed to reach all 20 pods simultaneously. "Know that whatever becomes of you, wherever you may journey, you carry with you the hope of your species. You are not just my children, but humanity's children, born to lead them to heights they cannot yet imagine. Be strong, be wise, be better than the world that seeks to diminish you." The moment that followed was described by Malcador as a pause in time itself, as if the universe held its breath before the catastrophe that would reshape galactic history. The Emperor stood surrounded by his sleeping sons, each one perfect in their individual way, each one destined for greatness beyond mortal comprehension. None of them knew that within hours, these perfect children would be torn from their father's protection and scattered across the galaxy like seeds cast into a storm. The laboratory that had been their nursery would become a tomb of shattered hopes, and the Emperor's greatest triumph would transform into his most devastating loss. But in that final moment of peace, before chaos tore through the barriers between dimensions, 20 perfect sons slept under their father's watchful gaze, loved beyond measure and destined for glories and tragedies that would echo through the ages. The last dawn of innocence was breaking, and none who witnessed it would ever be the same. Chapter 2. When the Veil Tore. Tech adept Kelbor Hal would later claim he felt the disturbance in the machine spirits 37 minutes before the first reality breach manifested in Laboratory Primus. His personal logs, recovered from the ruins of his workstation, describe a crescendo of electronic screams that seemed to emerge from every blessed mechanism in the Imperial Palace's deepest levels. The cogitators began displaying data that violated their core programming. Kelbor Hal recorded with the clinical precision that marked all his observations. Probability matrices calculating negative numbers, chronometers showing times that had not yet occurred, and, most disturbing of all, the biomonitors attached to the Primarch pods registering life signs that corresponded to no known biological pattern. Standing guard outside Laboratory Primus, Custodian Valdor felt the wrongness as a physical weight pressing against his superhuman awareness. His account, preserved in the sealed archives of the Adeptus Custodes, provides a warrior's perspective on the moment when the impossible became inevitable. The air itself grew thick, Valdor wrote, as though we stood at the bottom of an ocean that existed in dimensions our minds could not properly perceive. My guardian spear, blessed by the Emperor himself and inscribed with the most powerful protective wards known to Imperial artifice, began to vibrate with frequencies that made my enhanced bones ache. Through the reinforced doors of the laboratory, I could hear the Emperor's voice raised not in command, but in what I can only describe as warning. Within the sanctum, the Emperor stood at the center of his perfect circle. His consciousness expanded across multiple dimensional planes as he sought to understand the nature of the threat pressing against reality's boundaries. Malcador's testimony describes a scene that challenged every assumption about the limits of even the master of mankind's power. I witnessed my lord attempt to reinforce the barriers between dimensions using the full extent of his psychic might, the sigillite recorded. Golden light erupted from his form with such intensity that the very stones beneath our feet began to glow like heated metal. Yet, even as he poured his power into maintaining the sanctity of the laboratory, I could see cracks appearing in the air itself, jagged lines of absolute darkness that spoke of spaces where light and logic held no dominion. The breakthrough came without warning, reality simply ceasing to function according to natural law, in a sphere that expanded outward from a point precisely between the 10th and 11th gestation pods. The Emperor's protective wards, woven from equations that described the fundamental structure of existence, unraveled like cloth subjected to flames that burned concepts rather than matter. Through the breach poured entities that existed as much in metaphor as in any physical form. The Chaos Gods themselves, their attention focused on the laboratory with the intensity of cosmic predators detecting the scent of prey. Kelbor Hal's instruments recorded energy readings that broke his most sophisticated measuring devices. While outside the laboratory, Valdor felt his consciousness reel under the weight of presences that should not have been able to manifest in the material realm. They came not as armies or even as individual beings, Malcador wrote, but as concepts given terrible form. I perceived Tzeentch as an ever-changing pattern that hurt to observe directly, its form shifting between possibilities that had not yet been determined. Khorne manifested as pure rage given substance, while Nurgle appeared as a celebration of decay that found joy in endings. But it was the fourth presence that filled me with the greatest dread, Slaanesh, the youngest of the Chaos Gods, whose very existence spoke of pleasures and pains beyond mortal comprehension. The Emperor's response was immediate and devastating. His psychic might, normally restrained to levels that would not incinerate those around him, exploded outward with the force of a dying star. The laboratory filled with light that existed in spectra beyond visible perception, and his voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions that had no names in human language. "Be gone," the Emperor commanded, and his words carried the authority of one who had walked among the first shamans, who had guided humanity through its darkest hours, who had earned the right to stand against gods through millennia of sacrifice. "You have no dominion here." But the Chaos Gods had not come to fight, they had come to steal. Even as the Emperor's power drove them back, spectral hands reached through the cracks in reality toward the gestation pods. Not all at once, for that would have triggered defenses that even they could not overcome, but selectively, intelligently, targeting specific pods according to some cosmic design that mortal minds could not comprehend. "I watched in horror," Valdor recorded, as ethereal claws wrapped around the first pod, containing the child who would have been the lion. The crystal sphere simply faded from existence, not destroyed, but translated to a realm where the laws of physics held no meaning. Within moments, 3 more pods had vanished in the same manner, their perfect occupants stolen by entities whose hatred of the Emperor transcended rational understanding. The theft continued even as the Emperor marshaled every defense at his disposal. Ancient wards blazed with power that turned the laboratory's air into something resembling liquid lightning. Protective equations written into the structure's foundation activated, creating geometric barriers that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. Yet still the pods disappeared, winking out of existence as if they had never been. Kelbor Hal's final recordings capture the moment when 17 of the 20 pods had been stolen, their perfect occupants hurled into the warp by beings whose motivation transcended simple malice. "The machine spirits screamed," he wrote, "not with pain but with loss. They had been witnesses to perfection being torn apart by chaos, and their electronic consciousness could not process the magnitude of what had been stolen." In 37 minutes, 2 decades of the Emperor's greatest work had been undone by entities that viewed creation itself as an insult to their dominion. The battle for the final 3 pods was the most desperate. The Emperor, his power focused to levels that made reality itself unstable, managed to shield the 16th, 18th, and 19th pods from the Chaos God's grasp. But the effort required was so immense that the laboratory's structure began to collapse under the weight of energies never meant to exist in normal space. "My lord stood like a golden pillar of defiance," Malkador wrote, his form blazing with power that made looking upon him an act requiring superhuman will. Around him, the stolen pod's absence created voids in reality itself, spaces where existence simply was not, marked only by the echoes of what had been lost. The 3 remaining pods pulsed with energies that spoke of their occupants' distress, as if they somehow understood that their brothers had been torn away. The Chaos God's withdrawal was as sudden as their arrival, reality snapping back into normal configuration with a sound like the universe sighing in relief. But the damage was done. 17 of the Emperor's perfect sons had been stolen, cast into the warp to emerge on distant worlds that would shape them in ways their creator had never intended. In the aftermath, as smoke that existed in dimensions beyond the visible slowly cleared, the Emperor stood among the ruins of his greatest work. 3 pods remained, their occupants safe, but forever changed by their exposure to the raw forces of chaos. The other 17 had begun journeys that would take them across the galaxy to destinations unknown. "I found my lord kneeling before the space where the first pod had been," Malkador concluded his account, his golden features marked by an expression of loss so profound that I dared not approach. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute despair. "They have stolen my children and cast them into darkness. Whatever they become now will be shaped by forces I cannot control, influenced by worlds I have never seen. I have lost not just my sons, but the future I had planned for humanity itself. The veil between dimensions had torn and mended, but the consequences of that breach would echo through the millennia. 17 perfect beings had been scattered to the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same. Chapter 3. The Silent Voyage. In the spaces between heartbeats where time moves like honey and distance becomes merely a suggestion, 17 gestation pods tumbled through the warp on journeys that would define the fate of the galaxy. Each pod was a miracle of the Emperor's engineering, designed to protect its precious cargo through any conceivable danger. But the warp was not conceivable, and the forces that had stolen them were older than conception itself. The testimony I share comes from an impossible source, navigator Primus Alexei Zheng, who claimed in his final transmission to have witnessed the pod's passage through the Imperium during a routine warp translation gone catastrophically wrong. His account, dismissed by the navigator houses as the ravings of a mind broken by warp exposure, was preserved only because his ship's cogitators recorded his words in their automatic logs. "I saw them," Zheng transmitted as his vessel drifted helplessly in the warp's currents. 17 points of golden light moving through the immaterium like stars fallen from heaven. Each one was surrounded by presences, things that shepherded them toward destinations I could perceive but not comprehend. It was as if invisible hands were guiding them through the chaos, ensuring they would arrive precisely where they were meant to be. The pods moved through the warp not randomly, as conventional wisdom would suggest, but according to a design that transcended mortal understanding. Each one followed currents that had been shaped by the chaos gods themselves, the same entities that had stolen them now serving as their guides toward the worlds that would complete the work of corruption that had begun in their theft. Within the first pod, the child who would become Lionel Johnson floated in artificial amniotic fluid while his developing consciousness was exposed to visions of endless hunts through forests that existed only in nightmares. The warp showed him images of beasts so terrible that even mature minds would recoil from their contemplation, imprinting upon his growing psyche an understanding of predator and prey that would define his approach to warfare for millennia to come. The second pod carried Fulgrim, the child destined for perfection, through realms where beauty and horror intertwined in patterns that challenged every definition of aesthetic truth. His developing mind was exposed to visions of art so perfect it caused physical pain, of harmony so pure they could shatter souls, of beauty so intense it became indistinguishable from agony. The pods were not merely containers, Jing observed, his navigator's sight allowing him to perceive dimensions beyond normal human perception, but classrooms. Each one was being subjected to experiences that would prepare its occupant for the world they were destined to reach. It was education through exposure to impossibility, learning through immersion in concepts that mortal minds were never meant to process. The sixth pod, containing the future Lehman Russ, tumbled through spaces where the boundary between civilization and savagery had been erased entirely. Wild currents in the warp showed the developing Primarch visions of endless winter, of wolves running beneath aurora-lit skies, of combat that was art and art that was survival. His consciousness absorbed lessons about pack dynamics and the necessity of leadership through strength rather than law. But it was the 12th pod that drew Jing's most troubled observations. Within, the child who would become Angron was subjected to experiences that would mark his soul with a depth of rage that even his immense strength could never fully contain. The warp showed him visions of slavery and rebellion, of chains broken through violence and freedom purchased through blood. I watched that pod for subjective hours, Jung recorded, and in all that time, the currents around it pulsed with something that might have been sorrow. Even the entities guiding it seemed reluctant to expose the child to what was necessary for his development. Yet they did so anyway, because the design required it, because the future they were shaping demanded a son who understood suffering intimately enough to inspire it in others. The 17th pod, carrying Lorgar, moved through regions of the warp where faith had been given form and worship had become a living thing. The developing word-bearer was exposed to visions of gods both true and false, of belief systems that could reshape reality through pure conviction, of the terrible power that lay in absolute devotion to causes greater than individual existence. Zheng's final observations, recorded moments before his ship was consumed by the same warp currents he had been studying, provided insight into the most disturbing aspect of the pod's journey. They were not traveling alone. Each pod was accompanied by shadows, he transmitted, his voice growing weak as his exposure to the warp's energies reached lethal levels. Entities that matched pace with them through the Imperium, whispering to the developing consciousnesses within. I could not hear their words, but I could sense their purpose. They were teaching the children, preparing them for the roles they would play in a drama whose scope exceeded galactic boundaries. The journey through the warp was not measured in time as mortals understood it. Some pods experienced subjective centuries during their transit, their occupants aging through years of artificial development while exposed to lessons that would have driven mature minds to madness. Others passed through the Imperium in what seemed like moments, their passengers preserved in stasis while visions of their future destinies played out around them like fevered dreams. The 4th pod, destined to carry Perturabo to his fortress world, traveled through geometries that existed only in theoretical mathematics, exposing its occupant to architectural principles that transcended three-dimensional space. The developing Iron Warrior absorbed knowledge of fortification and siegecraft that came not from textbooks, but from observing how reality itself could be structured to resist assault from entities that existed in higher dimensions. I began to understand, Zheng's transmission continued, that the theft was not an act of malice, but of necessity. The Chaos Gods had not stolen the Emperor's children out of hatred alone, but because the future they desired required these specific beings to be shaped by specific experiences. Each pod was being delivered to a world that would complete the work that had begun in their creation, transforming them from perfect instruments into flawed but powerful weapons. The most disturbing aspect of the journey was the presence of what Zheng termed the Watchers, entities that observed the pod's passage without interfering directly. These beings radiated an intelligence that was vast but cold, studying the developing Primarchs with the detachment of scientists examining specimens. They were cataloging everything, Zheng reported, his sanity clearly deteriorating under the strain of prolonged warp exposure. Recording how each child responded to the visions, measuring their psychological development, noting which aspects of their personalities were being enhanced or suppressed by the journey. It was as if the entire voyage was an experiment, with the Primarchs as unwitting subjects in a study whose parameters had been established by minds that operated on timescales beyond mortal comprehension. The final moments of Zheng's transmission, before his ship vanished entirely into the warp's depths, contained observations that would have challenged the Emperor's understanding of his lost son's fate. "They are not lost," he proclaimed with the certainty of the dying. "They are being prepared. Each pod follows a course that was planned before their theft, guided toward worlds that will provide the exact experiences necessary to complete their transformation." The Emperor created perfect sons, but perfection was not what the galaxy required. It needed flawed champions, broken heroes, damaged saviors who would understand suffering intimately enough to inspire others to transcend it. The 17 pods continued their silent voyage through the warp. each one carrying a child whose destiny would shake the foundations of reality itself. Behind them, the rift created by their theft was already healing, leaving no trace of the catastrophe that had reshaped the future of human civilization. Ahead lay worlds both wonderful and terrible, where stolen sons would find new families, new purposes, and new forms of perfection that their father had never intended them to possess. Chapter 4. Caliban's Prince. The first pod to break real space emerged above Caliban like a falling star wrapped in fire. Its passage through the world's atmosphere creating aurora displays that the planet's primitive inhabitants had never witnessed before. Brother Amadiel of the Order was conducting his evening patrol along the northern ramparts when the heavens split with light that turned night into day for the space of 3 heartbeats. His journal, preserved in the chapter house archives that would later become the Rock, provides the only first-hand account of the moment that would transform Caliban from a forgotten death world into the birthplace of legends. I thought at first that we were witnessing divine intervention, Amadiel wrote in the careful script that marked him as one of the Order's scholar knights. The light that erupted across our sky was too pure to be natural, too purposeful to be mere celestial chance. It moved with intelligence, descending toward the Northlands, where even our bravest knights fear to venture. Caliban was a world shaped by isolation and surrounded by monsters that defied classification by any sane taxonomy. Great beasts stalked its endless forests, creatures that seemed to have crawled from the nightmares of madmen to establish themselves as the planet's true rulers. The human settlements clung to fortified positions scattered across the landscape, like islands in an ocean of perpetual threat. The Order had been founded by knights who understood that survival on Caliban required more than courage. It demanded a willingness to face horrors that could break the mind as easily as they could rend flesh. They were warrior monks who had elevated the hunt of the great beasts to a sacred duty, seeing in their endless struggle a reflection of humanity's battle against the darkness that surrounded all civilized life. Luther, the Order's greatest knight, was leading a patrol through the Ironwood when they discovered the crater. His account, dictated to the Order's scribes years later, captures the moment when destiny announced itself through the discovery of a child who should not have existed. The impact site was a perfect circle burned into the forest floor, Luther recorded, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the impossible. Ancient trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to crystalline ash. Yet at the crater's center lay an object that bore no resemblance to any falling star in recorded memory. It was a pod of some kind, crafted from materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The pod's surface was covered with inscriptions that hurt to observe directly, symbols that suggested meaning without revealing their purpose to minds untrained in their interpretation. When Luther's knights approached, their blessed weapons began to resonate with harmonics that spoke of power beyond their understanding. "We were prepared to find a demon weapon," Luther wrote, "some artifact of the great beasts sent to corrupt our sacred mission. What we discovered instead challenged every assumption we held about the nature of existence itself." Within the pod lay a child who appeared to be perhaps 2 years of age, though his size suggested development beyond normal human parameters. His hair was pale as starlight, his features noble even in unconsciousness, and his presence radiated a sense of destiny that made the surrounding air shimmer with potential. Brother Amadiel's technical observations, recorded with the precision of a trained scholar, noted aspects of the child that defied conventional understanding. The boy's vital signs were stable but unusual, he wrote. His heartbeat was slower than any human's should be, yet his pulse carried strength that suggested superhuman constitution. Most remarkably, the great beasts that normally stalked the ironwood were nowhere to be found. It was as if his presence had driven them away, or perhaps called them to some distant purpose we could not comprehend. The decision to take the child back to the chapter house was unanimous, though each knight understood they were accepting responsibility for something far beyond their experience. As they carried him from the crater, the forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the planet itself was waiting to see what manner of destiny had fallen from the stars. The journey back to civilization took 3 days, during which the knights observed phenomena that none would ever fully explain. The child, whom they had begun calling Johnson in honor of the ancient forests that surrounded them, displayed capabilities that challenged their understanding of human development. On the second night, Luther recorded, young Johnson awakened and walked among us as if he had always been part of our company. He spoke no words that we could understand, yet his presence communicated volumes. The great beasts that had tracked our party since leaving the crater maintained their distance, circling our camp but never approaching within bowshot. It was as though they recognized something in the boy that commanded their respect. The child's growth during those first months in the chapter house was remarkable. Within weeks, he had mastered the Order's language with a fluency that suggested not learning, but remembering. Within months, he was reading their sacred texts with an understanding that surpassed knights who had studied them for decades. Johnson possessed an intellect that could analyze any tactical problem with unprecedented clarity, Brother Amadiel observed in his chronicles. But more than intelligence, he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the hunt that exceeded anything in our traditions. He could predict the movement patterns of prey we had never successfully tracked, could identify weaknesses in fortifications that had stood unconquered for generations. By his 10th birthday, though none could be certain of his actual age, the boy who would become the lion had grown into a youth whose presence transformed every room he entered. The Knights of the Order, warriors who had faced the galaxy's horrors without flinching, found themselves deferring to his judgment on matters of strategy and tactics. Luther, who had become the boy's mentor and closest companion, recorded observations that spoke to the complex relationship developing between them. Johnson respects the wisdom of our traditions, he wrote, but he also sees beyond them to possibilities we have never considered. He speaks of uniting all Caliban under a single banner, of turning our scattered strongholds into a unified force capable of cleansing the entire world of the great beast's taint. His vision is grand beyond anything we have dared to imagine. Yet, when he speaks of it, the impossible begins to seem merely difficult. The child's combat abilities manifested early and dramatically. During a great beast incursion that threatened the chapter house itself, young Johnson requested permission to join the defense. The knight's initial reluctance was overcome by necessity when the attack proved more severe than anticipated. I watched a boy of perhaps 12 years stand against creatures that had challenged our greatest knights. Luther recorded with obvious pride and wonder. He moved with a precision that seemed to anticipate every attack, countering moves before they were made and exploiting weaknesses that existed for mere moments. It was not merely skill, but something approaching prescience, as if he could read the intentions of the great beasts in ways that exceeded normal human perception. The victory that day was so complete that the chapter house's defenders began to speak of divine intervention. But Luther, watching the boy clean his blade with movements that spoke of ingrained muscle memory, understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than supernatural assistance. Johnson was not merely fighting, he wrote in his private journal. He was hunting with a sophistication that had been bred into his very bones. This was not a skill learned through training, but an aspect of his essential nature, as fundamental to his being as breathing or thought. He was created for this, not just to fight, but to lead others in the eternal battle against darkness. The pod that had brought the lion to Caliban was preserved in the chapter house's deepest vaults, studied by the Order's greatest scholars but never fully understood. Its alien inscriptions remained stubbornly indecipherable, its materials resistant to all attempts at analysis. It served as a constant reminder that their adopted son was not merely an exceptionally gifted foundling, but something far more significant. "We have raised a prince," Luther concluded in his final entry about those early years, "though we do not know what kingdom he was born to rule. Caliban has shaped him into something it needs, a hunter capable of ending the great beast's reign forever. But I sometimes wonder if we have also shaped him into something the galaxy needs, though neither he nor we yet understand what that purpose might be." The boy who had fallen from the stars was growing into a legend, his destiny intertwining with Caliban's fate in ways that would echo across the centuries. The great beasts still stalked the forests, but their days were numbered. A prince had come to their realm, and he would not rest until the hunt was finished forever. Chapter 5. The Fenrisian Winter. The second pod to find its target struck Fenris during the season, the natives called the Long Dark, when the world's harsh sun disappeared behind eternal storm clouds, and the ice wolves sang their hunting songs across glaciers that stretched to the horizon. Bjorn, Stormwolf, was leading his pack through the Fanglands when the sky split with light that turned the aurora into day. His saga, preserved in the oral traditions that would later inspire the Space Wolves' greatest skalds, speaks of a night when the very stars seemed to descend to walk among mortals. The skyfire came like Fenris herself was giving birth, Bjorn would tell his listeners around the longhouse hearths. Light that burned cold as winter's heart, sound that shook the bones of the world. The ice wolves scattered like leaves before the storm, and even the great bears of the Iron Wolves clan sought shelter in their deepest caves. Fenris was a world that killed the weak without mercy, and forged the strong into weapons capable of surviving anything the galaxy might offer. Its human population lived in tribal confederations that rose and fell with the seasons, their survival dependent on their ability to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in the endless wilderness. The Vulca Fenrica, the wolves of Fenris, were not merely human, but something shaped by their world into something harder, more savage, more capable of the violence that survival demanded. They had learned to see in the darkness, to track prey across terrain that would challenge even mechanical sensors, to find strength in pack bonds that transcended mere tribal loyalty. The crater that marked the pod's impact was discovered by Bjorn's pack 3 days after the skyfire, when the worst of the storm had passed, and the wolves were hunting the great elk herds that migrated through the Ironlands during the dark season. What they found challenged every story their skalds had ever told about gifts from the sky. The crater was warm, Bjorn's saga records, as if summer had come to visit that one place while winter ruled everywhere else. The ice had melted in a perfect circle, revealing black earth that steamed in the cold air. At the center lay something that hurt the eyes to look upon, a vessel crafted by hands that understood secrets our smiths could never fathom. The pod's surface was covered with runes that seemed familiar yet foreign, as if someone had taken the sacred markings of Fenris and transformed them into something that spoke of wider purposes. When Bjorn's warriors approached, their iron weapons began to sing with harmonics that their ancestors would have recognized as the voice of the world spirit itself. "We expected to find treasure," the saga continues. "Gold or weapons that would make our clan the strongest on Fenris. What we discovered was worth more than all the gold ever pulled from the world's bones. A child who would grow to be worth 1,000 warriors." The boy within the pod appeared to be perhaps 18 months old, though his size suggested development beyond normal human parameters. His hair was the color of storm clouds. His eyes carried depths that seemed to reflect the aurora's light, and even in sleep he radiated a presence that made the pack wolves gather close in protective circles. Bjorn's account of the discovery carries the weight of prophecy fulfilled, though he could not have understood the significance of what he witnessed. When the boy opened his eyes, the saga records, the wolves stopped their howling. Not from fear, but from recognition. Here was one who spoke their language without words, who understood the pack law that governed all life on Fenris. The great she-wolf Freki, leader of the Ironlands pack, approached the child and touched her muzzle to his forehead. From that moment, we knew he was kin. The decision to adopt the child was made not by human consensus, but by the wolves themselves. The pack circled the crater for 3 days, their behavior unlike anything the hunters had observed in generations of living alongside the great predators. They were not guarding the boy so much as accepting him into their family structure, teaching him through scent and body language the complex social dynamics that governed pack survival. Bjorn's pack brother Heimdall, whose saga gift allowed him to see meanings in events that escaped ordinary perception, recorded observations that spoke to the child's true nature. The boy learned the wolf speech before he mastered human words, Heimdall's verses tell us. He could call the great pack leaders by name, could sing the hunting songs that drew prey within spear range, could howl warnings that made even the ice trolls seek shelter in their caves. This was not learning but remembering, as if the knowledge had been placed within him before his first breath. The winters of Fenris were merciless teachers, but young Russ, for that was the name the pack gave him, meaning Redmane in the old tongue, thrived in conditions that would have killed ordinary children. His growth during those first years was remarkable, not just for its speed, but for the way it seemed to respond to the world's challenges. Each season made him stronger, Bjorn's saga records. The ice storms that bent iron taught him endurance. The great hunts that lasted for weeks taught him patience. The pack wars that determined territory taught him leadership. By his 5th winter, he was leading hunts that brought down prey no single pack could normally challenge. The boy's combat abilities manifested in ways that seemed to channel the very spirit of Fenris itself. During the time of burning ice, when the Iron Wolves clan challenged Bjorn's pack for control of the richest hunting grounds, young Russ requested to stand trial by combat for his adopted family. The combat that followed became legendary even by Fenrisian standards. Russ, barely 6 years old, but already towering over grown men, faced the Iron Wolves' greatest champion with weapons that sang the old songs of ice and iron. The battle lasted from dawn until the first stars appeared, with neither combatant able to gain decisive advantage. Gunnar Iron Wolf was the strongest warrior our clans had produced in 3 generations. Heimdall's saga records. He had broken the backs of ice trolls with his bare hands, had wrestled the great bears of the northern peaks, and emerged victorious. Yet the boy-child fought him to a standstill, matching him strength for strength, answering every trick of combat with innovations that spoke of genius bred into bone and sinew. The fight ended not in victory but in recognition. Gunnar, bloodied but unbowed, knelt before the boy and offered the Iron Wolf's fealty to one whose strength clearly transcended mere human capability. From that moment, young Russ was acknowledged as the Wolf King of the northern clans, a leader whose authority derived not from birth or politics, but from demonstrated superiority in every skill that mattered on Fenris. He united the packs not through conquest, but through recognition, Bjorn's saga explains. The wolves saw in him something they had been waiting for. A king who spoke their language, who understood that leadership meant accepting responsibility for the pack's survival, who could inspire loyalty through deed rather than merely demand it through strength. The boy's strategic mind became apparent during the great hunt of his 8th winter, when the ice demons of the deep cold emerged from their glacial lairs to threaten all life in the northern territories. Previous encounters with these entities had resulted in massive casualties, as the demons seemed immune to conventional weapons and tactics. Russ analyzed the problem with an insight that impressed even the clan's wisest hunters. He understood that the ice demons were not merely monsters, but territorial predators, operating according to pack dynamics similar to those that governed wolf behavior. Instead of meeting them in direct combat, he orchestrated a campaign that used their own instincts against them. The boy king turned their strength into weakness, Heimdall recorded. He led hunting parties that struck at the demons' food sources, forcing them to divide their attention. He used their territorial nature to provoke conflicts between different demon packs. Most brilliantly, he turned the wolves themselves into weapons, teaching them to hunt the demons' scent trails and alert the human warriors to ambush opportunities. The campaign lasted an entire season and resulted in the first complete victory over the ice demons in recorded Fenrisian history. But more than tactical success, it demonstrated Russ's ability to see patterns and connections that escaped others, to understand how the seemingly chaotic violence of his world actually followed complex but comprehensible rules. He made us better, Bjorn's saga concludes, not just stronger or more skilled, but wiser in the ways of the hunt. Under his leadership, the northern clans learned to fight as one great pack, sharing intelligence and resources, supporting each other in ways our ancestors would never have considered possible. By his 10th year, the boy who had fallen from the stars had transformed the northern reaches of Fenris from a collection of feuding tribes into something approaching a unified kingdom. The great wolves that had once competed for territory now hunted together under his coordination. The human clans that had waged endless war now shared their knowledge and strength in service of common goals. Yet, despite his accomplishments, those closest to young Russ sensed that his destiny extended far beyond Fenris. During the quiet hours around the longhouse fires, when the wind sang its lonely songs across the ice fields, the boy would stare at the stars with an expression of longing that spoke to memories older than his years. He dreams of a greater pack, Heimdall observed in his private verses. Wolves that run between the stars themselves, battles that span distances our minds cannot measure, hunts that will determine the fate of all things. Fenris has given him strength and wisdom, but he was not born for this world alone. He is Winter's prince, but also something more, a king whose kingdom waits among the distant lights. The pod that had carried him to Fenris remained in the place of honor within Bjorn's lodge, its alien materials proof that their adopted son was destined for purposes beyond their understanding. Yet none among the clans regretted the choice to raise him as their own. He had given them something precious: unity, purpose, and the knowledge that even in the darkest winter the pack endures. The boy who would become the Wolf King had found his home among the ice and storm, but the stars still called to him with voices that spoke of battles yet to be fought and brothers yet to be found. Chapter 6: The Gladiator's Cage. The third pod found its mark in the fighting pits of Deshea, capital city of Nuceria, where the roar of crowds and the smell of blood had become the planet's defining characteristics. Overseer Kadir was inspecting the gladiator pens when the sky above the arena complex erupted with light that turned night into a crimson dawn. His ledger, discovered among the ruins of the gladiator school years later, provides the only written account of the moment that would doom and define the life of the child who would become Angron. The impact struck the eastern practice yards with the force of an orbital bombardment, Kadir wrote in the cramped script of someone accustomed to recording human merchandise. Yet, when the dust cleared, we found not destruction, but a gift, something that would make us the richest gladiator house in New Syria's history, though the price of that wealth would prove higher than any of us could imagine. New Syria was a world built on the principle that suffering could be transformed into entertainment, that violence refined through artificial constraints could become art. The planet's ruling houses had elevated gladiatorial combat to the highest form of cultural expression, creating an entire civilization dedicated to the proposition that watching others die was the ultimate pleasure. The gladiator schools served as factories for producing warriors whose lives were measured not in years, but in victories, whose worth was calculated in the amount of blood they could shed while dying beautifully enough to earn the crowd's approval. These were not merely fighters, but performers, trained to make their own destruction into spectacle worthy of the nobles who owned them. Kadir's school was among the most prestigious, known for producing gladiators whose technical skill and dramatic flair commanded premium prices in the arena markets. His ledgers recorded the purchase and sale of human lives with the same precision used for livestock, each entry representing someone whose entire existence had been reduced to their capacity for profitable violence. The pod they discovered in the practice yards defied easy categorization. Its surface bore markings that seemed to shift when observed from different angles, suggesting technological sophistication far beyond anything in New Syria's databases. When Kadir's workers approached with their cutting tools, the pod systems activated with harmonics that made the arena's stone foundations resonate like struck bells. We expected to find weapons, or perhaps exotic materials that could be sold to the high houses, Kadir recorded. What we discovered instead was something that would transform our understanding of what human beings could become when pushed beyond the boundaries of possibility. The child within appeared to be perhaps 2 years old, though his size and bone density suggested development beyond normal parameters. His hair was dark as old blood. His features carried a nobility that spoke of genetic optimization, and even in unconsciousness he radiated a presence that made the veteran gladiators step back in unconscious respect. But it was the child's reaction to awakening that convinced Kadir he had found something unprecedented. Instead of the confusion and terror that marked most slave children brought to the pits, the boy examined his surroundings with tactical assessment that belonged to a seasoned warrior analyzing a potential battlefield. He understood immediately what manner of place he had come to, Kadir's notes record. Not just a school for fighters, but a factory for producing death spectacles. I watched him observe the practice sessions, studying the techniques being taught, analyzing the weaknesses in our training methods. Within hours, he was pointing out tactical errors that our veteran instructors had never noticed. The decision to place the boy in training was made as much from curiosity as from profit motive. Kadir had spent decades identifying potential gladiators among the slave markets, and his instincts told him this child possessed capabilities that could redefine what audiences expected from arena combat. The training regimen began with basic conditioning, but young Angron, for that was the name his fellow slaves gave him, meaning angry one in their shared patois, demonstrated abilities that forced constant revision of the curriculum. His strength exceeded that of gladiators twice his age, recorded Master-at-Arms Karelian, whose training notes were preserved in the school's archives. But more remarkable was his ability to analyze combat situations with unprecedented clarity. He could predict an opponent's next 3 moves based on subtle changes in stance, could identify weaknesses in defensive positions that experienced fighters had missed, could adapt his fighting style to counter techniques he had never encountered before. Yet it was not just individual skill that set Angron apart, but his effect on the other gladiators. Despite his young age, he became a focal point around which the slave fighters began to organize themselves into something resembling a military unit rather than a collection of individual performers. He gave them something they had never possessed, Corallian noted with obvious unease: purpose beyond mere survival. Under his influence, the gladiators began to see themselves not as entertainment for their masters, but as warriors fighting for something greater than individual glory. This was dangerous thinking that threatened the entire structure upon which our industry was built. The boy's first arena appearance, at age 8, became legendary throughout Nuceria. Facing an opponent twice his size and armed with superior weapons, Angron demonstrated a fighting style that combined technical precision with an intensity that left audiences stunned into silence. He did not merely defeat his opponent, reported Arena Chronicle Valius in his official match record. He dismantled him with surgical precision, targeting nerve clusters and joint articulations with knowledge that suggested formal medical training. Yet throughout the combat, his expression remained calm, almost serene, as if the violence was merely a mathematical exercise requiring correct solutions. The victory marked the beginning of a career that would redefine arena combat, but also the start of a tragedy that would haunt Angron for the remainder of his existence. Each triumph in the pits was purchased with pieces of his humanity. Each victory celebration was followed by nights of rage that spoke to deeper wounds than any blade could inflict. Master Trainer Dryvac, who worked more closely with Angron than anyone else during those formative years, recorded observations that spoke to the complex psychology developing within the young gladiator. The boy possessed capabilities that exceeded anything in our experience, Dryvac wrote in his private journal. Yet I sensed that these abilities came with a cost he was only beginning to understand. During training sessions, I sometimes caught glimpses of something deeper than mere combat skill, flashes of tactical genius that suggested he was born for leadership on scales far greater than arena combat. But the gladiator pits were teaching him that violence was the only reliable form of communication, that strength expressed through brutality was the only currency that mattered. The installation of the neural implants came during Angron's 12th year, when his popularity with arena audiences had begun to attract the attention of the high houses. The butcher's nails, as they were known in the gladiator schools, were supposed to be the ultimate refinement, technological augmentation that would transform good fighters into unstoppable killing machines. The procedure was presented as an honor, Kadir recorded with the clinical detachment that marked all his business transactions. The most successful gladiators received the nails as a reward for their service, a mark of distinction that elevated them above their peers. We told Angron that the implants would make him the greatest fighter Nuceria had ever produced. The reality was far more sinister. The butcher's nails were designed to stimulate the brain's aggression centers while suppressing higher cognitive functions, creating warriors who were incapable of experiencing satisfaction through any means except violence. They were addiction devices, ensuring that their recipients would crave combat with an intensity that made withdrawal impossible. The change in Angron following the implantation was immediate and devastating. The tactical genius who had revolutionized arena combat was gradually replaced by something that existed primarily to kill. His fighting style became less artistic and more brutally efficient, his victories more decisive, but also more disturbing to witness. We had created the perfect gladiator, Dryvac wrote in his final entries before leaving Kadir's service in disgust. A being who could win any fight through sheer ferocity and skill, but in the process, we had destroyed something precious, a mind that might have reshaped the galaxy had it been allowed to develop without the artificial constraints we imposed upon it. Yet, even as the nails took their toll, something of Angren's original nature persisted. During the quiet moments between matches, when the neural implant's influence was at its weakest, the other gladiators saw glimpses of the leader he might have been. He began to speak of freedom, not just for himself, but for all those trapped in the endless cycle of violence that defined Nucerian society. The rebellion that would mark the end of his gladiator career was still years away, but its seeds were planted during those dark nights when Angren shared visions of a world where strength served purposes greater than entertainment, where warriors fought for causes that transcended individual survival. He never forgot what we had stolen from him, Kadir concluded in his final entry about the young gladiator. Even as the nails made him into the perfect killing machine, some part of him remembered being something more. That memory became the source of a rage that no amount of violence could satisfy, a fury that would eventually consume not just his enemies but everything he had ever loved. The boy who had fallen from the stars had found his home in the gladiator pits, but the cost of that education would echo through the millennia. The butcher's nails had made him into a weapon of unparalleled effectiveness, but they had also ensured that he would never know peace, never experience satisfaction, never be more than a slave to the violence that had shaped him. In the darkness of the gladiator pens, surrounded by others who had been broken by the same system that had created him, Angren dreamed of freedom. But the nails made certain that those dreams would always be colored by the rage that had become his defining characteristic. Chapter 7. The Colchis Mysteries. The pod that carried the future Lorgar struck Colchis during the Festival of Sacred Convergence, when all the world's competing faiths gathered in the desert city of Varadesh to debate the nature of divine truth. Monk scriptor Cor Ferron was copying sacred texts in the monastery of illuminated thought when the sky cracked open like an egg and golden light poured forth to baptize the faithful in fire. His chronicle, preserved in the Covenant's holiest archives, captures the moment when prophecy stepped from the realm of metaphor into brutal reality. The heavens declared the truth we had been teaching for generations, Cor Ferron wrote in the elaborate script reserved for recording divine revelations. That gods walk among mortals, that the faithful shall be rewarded with miraculous signs, that those who seek truth with pure hearts shall witness wonders beyond imagination. What fell from the sky that night was not mere chance, but destiny manifest in forms our limited understanding could barely comprehend. Colchis was a world built upon the foundation of absolute faith, where competing religious orders had transformed theological debate into the highest form of intellectual achievement. The planet's cities were vast libraries dedicated to preserving every spiritual tradition humanity had ever conceived, their archives containing millions of texts that explored the relationship between mortal and divine from every conceivable perspective. The Covenant of Colchis, the religious order that dominated the planet's spiritual landscape, taught that truth could only be approached through the synthesis of all faiths, that every religion contained fragments of ultimate reality that could be assembled into complete understanding through careful study and contemplation. They were scholars first and believers second, though their scholarship had led them to conclusions that more pragmatic minds might have questioned. The crater that marked the pod's impact was discovered by a pilgrimage party led by Brother Erebus, a young monk whose analytical mind had already begun to identify patterns in the sacred texts that suggested connections between apparently unrelated faith traditions. The impact site radiated energies that made our religious instruments resonate with harmonics we had never recorded. Erebus reported to the Covenant's Council of Truth Seekers. The very ground had been transformed into something resembling sanctified crystal, as if the falling object had imposed its own definition of holiness upon the material realm. This was not destruction but consecration, not impact but benediction. The pod itself defied classification according to any known technological paradigm. Its surface bore inscriptions that seemed to shift between different writing systems, sometimes displaying text in languages the monks recognized from their ancient archives, other times showing symbols that belonged to no human tradition, yet somehow conveyed meaning directly to the observer's consciousness. We approached the object with appropriate reverence, Cor Ferron recorded, understanding that we stood in the presence of something that transcended the boundary between material and spiritual realms. When the pod's surface became transparent, revealing its contents, we knew that our faith had been rewarded with a gift beyond measure. The child within appeared to be perhaps 18 months old, though his features carried a dignity that suggested wisdom beyond his apparent years. His skin seemed to glow with inner light. His hair held traces of gold that reflected illumination from sources that remained invisible, and his presence filled the surrounding area with a sense of peace that made even the desert's predators withdraw to respectful distances. When the boy opened his eyes and looked upon his discoverers, Brother Erebus later claimed that he experienced a moment of perfect spiritual clarity, as if the child's gaze had opened pathways to understanding that years of study had never revealed. He looked upon us with recognition, Erebus recorded in his personal journal, not as strangers discovering him by chance, but as faithful servants who had been chosen to witness the arrival of something miraculous. In his eyes, I saw reflected all the wisdom contained in our archives, all the truth we had been seeking through decades of scholarship, all the divine mystery that had driven our order's existence. The decision to raise the child within the Covenant's halls was made unanimously by the Council of Truth Seekers, though their reasons extended beyond simple charity. The boy's arrival had fulfilled prophecies found in texts representing dozens of different faith traditions, suggesting that his presence was significant in ways that transcended any single religious interpretation. Young Lorgar, for that was the name the texts suggested he should bear, meaning truth speaker in the old tongue, demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about human development. Within weeks of his arrival, he was reading sacred texts in languages he had never encountered, asking questions that revealed understanding of theological concepts that had taken the monks decades to master. The boy possessed an intuitive grasp of spiritual matters that exceeded anything in our experience, Cor Ferron observed during those early years. He could identify connections between apparently unrelated faith traditions, could synthesize competing theological positions into harmonious understanding, could explain complex mystical concepts in ways that made them accessible to minds of any educational level. But it was not just intellectual comprehension that set Lorgar apart. It was his ability to inspire absolute devotion in those around him. The monks who served as his teachers found themselves experiencing their faith with renewed intensity, discovering deeper meanings in familiar texts, sensing divine presence in ways that had seemed impossible before his arrival. Brother Narek, who served as Lorgar's primary instructor in comparative theology, recorded observations that spoke to the child's unique effect on those around him. Teaching Lorgar was unlike any educational experience I had ever encountered, Narek wrote. He did not simply absorb information, but transformed it, finding patterns and connections that revealed new layers of meaning in texts I had studied for decades. More remarkably, his understanding seemed to awaken similar insights in others. Conversations with him left me feeling as though I had been touched by divine inspiration, as if his presence had opened channels of communication with spiritual realms I had only read about in theoretical texts. The boy's first public appearance, during the Festival of Sacred Convergence in his 5th year, became legendary throughout Colchis. Asked to address the gathered representatives of the planet's religious orders, young Lorgar delivered a discourse on the unity underlying apparent spiritual diversity that left audiences weeping with the recognition of truth they had always known but never been able to articulate. He spoke not as a child, but as a prophet, recorded Festival Chronicle Argyle Tal in his official account. His words carried weight that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the merely audible. As he explained how all the galaxy's faiths were merely different paths toward the same ultimate truth, I felt my own understanding expanding to encompass concepts that had always seemed contradictory. This was not learning, but enlightenment, not education, but revelation. Yet, even as Lorgar's reputation as a spiritual prodigy spread across Colchis, those closest to him began to sense that his interests extended beyond the planet's traditional faith structures. During his private studies, he devoted increasing attention to texts that dealt with entities existing in realms beyond normal space-time, powers that operated according to principles unknown to conventional theology. Cor Phaeron, who had become the boy's primary mentor and father figure, recorded conversations that spoke to Lorgar's growing fascination with forces that most religious scholars preferred to treat as metaphorical rather than literal. The boy asks questions that challenge the foundations of our teaching, Cor Phaeron wrote in his private journal. He speaks of gods not as abstract principles or moral frameworks, but as actual entities capable of direct intervention in material affairs. His theological inquiries have begun to explore territories that our order has always considered dangerous, realms where faith becomes something more active and potentially more costly than mere intellectual exercise. The first manifestation of what would later be recognized as psychic abilities occurred during Lorgar's 8th year, when his passionate defense of a controversial theological position during a scholarly debate caused the air around him to shimmer with energies that made every religious artifact in the chamber resonate with harmonics that belonged to no known acoustic phenomenon. The boy's words carried power that transcended mere rhetoric, observed Master Theologian Mal Kedra, who had been present during the incident. As he spoke about the need for humanity to embrace its spiritual destiny, reality itself seemed to respond to his conviction. I felt the presence of vast intelligences focusing their attention on our discussion, as if his passionate faith had attracted the notice of entities existing in realms we had only theorized about. These displays of supernatural capability, rather than alarming his teachers, only confirmed their belief that Lorgar was destined for purposes that exceeded conventional understanding. The Covenant's archives contained numerous references to individuals whose spiritual development had transcended normal human limitations, and they interpreted the boy's growing abilities as evidence of divine favor, rather than cause for concern. We understood that we were witnessing the emergence of something unprecedented, Cor Phaeron concluded in his assessment of Lorgar's development. A being who possessed not just theoretical knowledge of divine truth, but practical ability to channel spiritual forces into material reality. Under our guidance, he would become more than a scholar or teacher. He would become a bridge between the realm of mortals and the domain of gods themselves. By his 10th year, the boy who had fallen from the stars had transformed the Covenant of Colchis from a collection of competing theological factions into a unified movement dedicated to the proposition that gods were not just subjects for academic study, but entities demanding active worship and service. His teachings had given them a sense of purpose that transcended intellectual curiosity, a mission that would eventually carry them to the stars themselves. Yet even as Lorgar's influence reshaped the spiritual landscape of Colchis, those with the wisdom to see beyond surface appearances understood that the boy's destiny extended far beyond their world. In the quiet hours when he studied the most ancient texts, references to cosmic conflicts and galactic-scale religious wars, they sensed that he was preparing for battles that would determine the spiritual fate of humanity itself. The pod that had brought him to Colchis remained in the place of honor within the Covenant's holiest shrine, its alien inscription serving as a constant reminder that their adopted son was intended for purposes beyond their understanding. But they had given him something precious in return: absolute faith in the reality of divine power, and the conviction that worship was not just an intellectual exercise, but a practical necessity for any species that hoped to survive in a universe where gods walked among mortals. The truth speaker had found his calling among the faithful of Colchis, but the truths he would ultimately proclaim would reshape the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to believe. Chapter 8: The Medusan Furnace. The pod carrying the future. Ferrus Manus struck Medusa during the season of the Great Forging, when the planet's volcanic activity reached its peak and the clan ships rode the thermal currents above seas of molten rock. Ironfather Thane was leading a salvage expedition through the Felgarthi crater fields when the sky split with light that turned the ever-present smoke clouds into mirrors of burning copper. His forge log, etched in steel plates using the traditional clan script, provides the only first-hand account of the moment that would transform Medusa from a world of competing forge clans into the birthplace of the Iron Hands. The sky metal came down like the wrath of the machine god made manifest, Thane recorded in the angular runes that marked him as a master of the ancient crafts. Not as mere ore that could be worked by mortal hands, but as something that carried within its structure the very essence of perfect metal. The impact crater steamed not with heat but with potential, as if the falling star had brought with it secrets that could reshape our understanding of what iron and flesh could become. Medusa was a world built upon the principle that strength could only be achieved through the marriage of flesh and metal, that human frailty could be overcome through the disciplined application of technological augmentation. The planet's clan structure revolved around forge complexes that served as both industrial centers and religious sites, where the creation of superior machinery was considered the highest form of worship. The clan Raukan had earned their position through generations of metallurgical innovation, developing techniques for working metals that existed nowhere else in the sector. Their forges produced weapons and tools that commanded premium prices throughout the local systems, their reputation built upon the principle that perfect function required perfect materials shaped by perfect technique. The crater that marked the pod's impact was discovered by scouts riding wind riders through the thermal columns that rose from Medusa's volcanic fields. What they found challenged every assumption about the nature of metal itself. The impact site was a perfect circle of crystallized rock, reported Scout Leader Bax in his official survey. But at the center lay something that defied classification by any metallurgical standard we possessed. The object appeared to be crafted from materials that existed in states between solid and liquid, between organic and mechanical, between matter as we understood it, and something that spoke to possibilities beyond our current comprehension. The pod's surface showed qualities that seemed to respond to observation itself. When the clan Raukan metallurgists approached with their analysis tools, the alien material shifted its properties to accommodate their investigations, becoming harder when tested for durability, more conductive when probed for electrical characteristics, more flexible when subjected to stress examinations. We understood immediately that we stood in the presence of technology that exceeded our current capabilities, Ironfather Thane recorded. Yet, rather than discouraging us, this recognition inspired a determination to prove ourselves worthy of whatever gifts the sky metal might contain. The machine god had sent us a test, and we would demonstrate that the children of Medusa could meet any challenge. When the pod finally opened, revealing its contents, the clansmiths found themselves staring at a child who appeared to embody everything their culture valued most highly. The boy seemed to be perhaps 2 years old, though his bone density and muscular development suggested capabilities beyond normal human parameters. But it was his hands that drew their immediate attention. Even in infancy, they showed calluses that spoke of familiarity with tools and forge work. The child bore the marks of one born to the craft, Thane observed, with the reverence that marked a master recognizing potential apprentice material. His fingers showed the scarring that came from working with hot metal. His palms bore the strengthening that developed through seasons of hammer work. Yet these marks existed on flesh that had never known the touch of earthly flame, as if the knowledge of metalworking had been bred into his very bones. The decision to raise the boy within the forge complex was unanimous among the clan leadership, though their reasons extended beyond simple charity. The child's arrival had been prophesied in forge songs that dated back to Medusa's earliest colonization, texts that spoke of one who would come from the sky to show them new paths in the ancient craft. Young Ferris, for that was the name the forge song suggested he should bear, meaning iron strong in the old clan tongue, demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about human development. Within months of his arrival, he was working alongside experienced smiths, his small hands manipulating tools with precision that exceeded craftsmen who had devoted decades to perfecting their techniques. The boy possessed an intuitive understanding of metal that transcended conventional learning, recorded Master Smith Gaius during those early years. He could determine a material's properties through touch alone, could predict how alloys would behave under stress, could identify flaws in worked metal that our most sophisticated instruments had missed. This was not knowledge acquired through training, but understanding that seemed to emerge from his essential nature. But it was not just technical skill that set Ferris apart. It was his ability to see possibilities in metalwork that had escaped generations of Medusan craftsmen. His innovations began simply: improvements to existing techniques that increased efficiency or enhanced durability. But as he grew older, his modifications became more ambitious, suggesting approaches to metallurgy that bordered on the revolutionary. Forge Master Folk, who supervised much of Ferris's early training, recorded observations that spoke to the child's unique perspective on the relationship between flesh and metal. The boy understood something that we had always accepted without question, Folk wrote in his technical journals, that the distinction between organic and mechanical was artificial, that flesh and metal were simply different expressions of the same underlying principles. His forge work began to incorporate biological concepts into mechanical design, creating tools that seemed to grow rather than being assembled, weapons that adapted to their users' needs rather than requiring adaptation from their wielders. The first major demonstration of Ferris's capabilities came during his 7th year, when a clan war threatened to destroy the forge complex. Rival clans had united to challenge Clan Raukan's dominance, bringing weapons and warriors that outnumbered the defenders by significant margins. Traditional tactics suggested that the forge complex would fall within days. Ferris analyzed the situation with strategic insight that belonged to a seasoned military commander rather than a child. But more importantly, he proposed solutions that demonstrated his unique understanding of how technology could be used to multiply force effectiveness. The boy crafted weapons that seemed to anticipate their users' intentions, reported war leader Karan in his battle assessment. Blades that struck with precision beyond what the wielder's skill should have allowed. Shields that seemed to know where attacks would come from. Armor that distributed impact forces in ways that turned potentially fatal blows into mere inconveniences. Fighting with Ferris's creations was like wielding extensions of one's own will, rather than external tools. The victory was so complete that the attacking clans abandoned their assault and petitioned for alliance rather than continuing a war they could no longer hope to win. But more significant than tactical success was the recognition that Ferris had introduced innovations that would reshape Medusan warfare permanently. The boy's most famous achievement came during his 9th year, when he volunteered to undertake the ritual known as the Iron Trial. This ancient test required participants to forge a weapon using only their bare hands and whatever materials they could gather from Medusa's volcanic wastes, creating something that would demonstrate both technical skill and spiritual understanding of the forged craft's deeper mysteries. What Ferris accomplished during the Iron Trial exceeded anything in our clan's recorded history, Thane wrote with obvious pride. Working in the heart of the Gorgon's throne, the most active volcanic region on Medusa, he forged not just a weapon, but something that transcended the boundary between tool and living being. The blade he created seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Its edge grew sharper with use rather than duller, and its balance adjusted itself to complement whatever fighting style its wielder employed. But the most remarkable aspect of Ferris's trial was what happened to his hands during the forging process. Extended contact with the living metal he was shaping began to transform his flesh, replacing skin and bone with substances that retained organic flexibility while gaining metallic durability. We watched his hands become something that belonged neither to flesh nor metal, but to both simultaneously, recorded Forge Priest Oros, who served as witness to the trial. The transformation was not corruption but evolution, not replacement but enhancement. His fingers retained their sensitivity to texture and temperature while gaining the strength to shape molten steel without tools. It was as if the machine god had chosen to demonstrate through his flesh what the perfected fusion of organic and mechanical could achieve. The living metal that had transformed Ferris's hands proved to be more than mere technological advancement. It carried within its structure patterns that seemed to respond to his emotional state, his tactical assessments, even his unconscious desires for specific tool configurations. His hands became workshops unto themselves, capable of forging implements that no external equipment could have produced. Master Smith Gaius documented the boy's post-trial capabilities with the detailed precision that marked all Medusan technical records. Ferris could shape metal by touch alone, Gaius observed, his transformed hands serving as forge, anvil, and hammer simultaneously. But more remarkable was his ability to communicate his understanding to others through direct contact. When he worked alongside other smiths, touching their hands to guide their technique, they reported experiencing moments of perfect comprehension, seeing possibilities in metalwork that had been invisible to them moments before. The transformation spread beyond the physical, as Ferris's influence began to reshape Clan Raukon's entire approach to the forge crafts. Under his guidance, the clan smiths began experimenting with techniques that blurred the line between technology and biology, creating weapons that grew stronger through use, armor that learned from the wounds it suffered, tools that adapted to their users' evolving needs. The boy taught us that perfection was not a destination but a process, Thane concluded in his assessment of Ferris's impact on their clan. That the highest achievement in metalwork was not creating objects that never changed, but forging things that could continue to improve themselves indefinitely. Under his influence, our forge complex became something unprecedented, a place where metal itself was taught to learn. By his 10th year, the boy who had fallen from the stars had transformed the forge clans of Medusa from competing industrial factions into something approaching a unified technological brotherhood. His innovations had given them capabilities that exceeded anything their rivals could match. His strategic insights had shown them how to leverage technological superiority into political dominance, and his presence had provided them with a sense of purpose that transcended mere material success. Yet, even as Ferris's influence spread across Medusa, those with the wisdom to see beyond immediate achievements understood that the boy's destiny extended far beyond their volcanic world. In the quiet hours when he studied star charts recovered from ancient clan archives, references to forge worlds and technological civilizations scattered across the galaxy, they sensed that he was preparing for challenges that would test everything their planet had taught him. He speaks of the great work, Thane recorded in his private observations, a project that would require the cooperation of forge clans spread across multiple star systems, the development of technologies that could reshape the very structure of matter itself. Our world has given him the foundation of understanding, but the edifice he plans to build will span distances our minds can barely comprehend. The pod that had brought him to Medusa remained in the place of honor within the clan's holiest forge, its alien materials serving as both inspiration and challenge to smiths who sought to understand its construction. Analysis had revealed that its structure incorporated principles that seemed to bridge the gap between matter and energy, between mechanical function and organic adaptation. But the greatest gift Medusa had given Ferris was not technical knowledge but philosophical understanding, the recognition that strength came not from choosing between flesh and metal, but from finding ways to make them work together in perfect harmony. His transformed hands were merely the most visible symbol of a deeper truth he had learned to embody. The boy has shown us the future of our species, Oros concluded in his spiritual assessment of Ferris's development. Not the replacement of flesh with metal, as some have advocated, but the evolution of both into something that transcends the limitations of either. Under his guidance, we have glimpsed what humanity might become when it learns to see technology not as external tool, but as extension of will itself. The iron-handed prince had found his calling among the forge fires of Medusa, but the greatest works he would create would require resources and challenges that no single world could provide. Chapter 9: The Void Between Stars. In the space between spaces, where light grows thin and gravity becomes merely a suggestion, two pods drifted through emptiness that had never known the touch of stellar radiation. These carried the lost Primarchs, the 2nd and the 11th, whose names would be struck from Imperial records and whose existence would become the Imperium's most carefully guarded secret. The account I share comes from a source that should not exist. The final transmission of deep-range survey vessel cartographer's Dream, whose crew reported contact with objects that challenged every assumption about what should have been possible in the galaxy's most desolate regions. We detected them during our routine sweep of the Ghoul Star's periphery, transmitted navigator Korak Vash, as his ship drifted helplessly in gravitational currents that followed no natural pattern. Two objects moving in perfect synchronization through space that contained no stellar bodies, no gravitational influences, nothing that could explain their coordinated motion. When we moved to investigate, we discovered something that our instruments could detect, but our minds could not fully process. The pods moved through the void in patterns that suggested intelligence, but followed no orbital mechanics known to Imperial science. They seemed to be navigating by principles that transcended conventional physics, following courses that led not toward any destination but away from everything, as if they were fleeing from the very concept of discovery. Senior astropath Mikhail Korvin, whose psychic abilities had guided the cartographer's Dream through dozens of successful surveys, reported experiences during their approach that challenged his understanding of how consciousness functioned in the vacuum of space. The pods radiated something that was not quite thought, but approximated it closely enough to affect those with psychic sensitivity. Corvin transmitted, his words carrying harmonics of strain that suggested prolonged exposure to influences his mind was not equipped to process. I perceived presence, intelligence, but directed inward rather than outward, as if whatever existed within those vessels was contemplating concepts too vast for external expression. The first pod, containing the second Primarch, showed signs of having been modified during its journey through the void. Its surface bore markings that had not been present when it left the Emperor's laboratory. Inscriptions that seemed to shift between languages that predated human civilization and symbols that belonged to no known writing system. Tech adept Zorvan, whose analytical capabilities had never failed during 2 decades of deep space exploration, found his instruments returning readings that violated basic principles of technological function. The pod's energy signature fluctuated in patterns that suggested active internal systems, Zorvan reported, yet scans indicated no detectable power source, no mechanical components that could account for the readings we were receiving. It was as if the vessel was being sustained by principles that our science had not yet discovered, operating according to laws that existed outside the standard model of reality. The second pod, carrying the 11th Primarch, presented even more disturbing characteristics. Its structure seemed to exist in a state of constant flux, shifting between configurations that suggested different possible destinies for its occupant. One moment it appeared designed for military purposes, the next it showed modifications that spoke to scientific exploration. Then it would reconfigure itself around patterns that defied classification entirely. We were witnessing something that challenged the concept of fixed identity, Navigator Vash observed as his ship's systems began to malfunction in ways that suggested exposure to influences that operated outside normal space-time, as if the pod's occupant existed in multiple states simultaneously, his potential futures so vast that the vessel itself could not determine what form it should take to best serve his needs. The crew's attempts to establish communication with either pod resulted in experiences that would haunt them for the remainder of their brief lives. The entities within, for they could not be called children despite their apparent age, responded to contact attempts with communications that bypassed conventional sensory input entirely. I felt their attention turned toward our ship, Astropath Corvin reported, and in that moment of contact, I experienced something that resembled telepathic communication, but operated according to principles that my training had never prepared me to handle. They were curious about our presence, but their curiosity existed on scales that made individual consciousness seem insignificant. It was like being noticed by concepts rather than beings. The second Primarch's communication carried undertones of infinite sadness, as if he had already seen the futures that awaited him and found them lacking in possibilities that would justify the effort of existence. His psychic presence suggested a mind that had looked beyond the boundaries of the material universe and discovered truths that made conventional ambition seem pointless. He showed me visions, Corvin continued, his transmission growing weaker as his exposure to alien influences reached dangerous levels. Civilizations that had risen and fallen while his pod drifted through the void, entire species that had achieved greatness only to discover that greatness itself was merely another form of limitation. He had witnessed the ultimate futility of all striving, the inevitable entropy that reduced all achievements to cosmic dust. The 11th Primarch's communication was different, but equally disturbing. Instead of despair, his psychic signature radiated a form of intellectual curiosity that had grown beyond any conceivable boundaries, a hunger for knowledge that would never be satisfied regardless of what truths he might discover. His mind was like a library that contained every book that had ever been written, Corvin reported. Yet he remained perpetually unsatisfied because he could conceive of books that had never been written, knowledge that had never been discovered, questions that had never been asked. His curiosity had become a force that could consume entire civilizations in its search for new things to understand. As the cartographer's dreams systems continued to deteriorate under exposure to the pod's influence, the crew began to understand why these two Primarchs had been lost to the void, rather than delivered to worlds that could have shaped them into the Emperor's intended tools. They were too perfect, Navigator Vash concluded in his final coherent transmission. Not flawed enough to be contained by the limitations that make effective leadership possible. The second had achieved such complete understanding of existence's ultimate meaninglessness that he could not be motivated to take action for any conventional purpose. The 11th had developed such unlimited curiosity that he could not focus on any single goal long enough to achieve meaningful progress toward it. The pod's response to prolonged observation was to begin moving away from the survey vessel, not through conventional propulsion, but through methods that seemed to involve the manipulation of space-time itself. They created a gravitational wake that drew the cartographer's dream after them, deeper into the void where no Imperial vessel had ever ventured. "We are being pulled into regions that do not appear on any star chart," Vash reported as his ship's navigation systems failed entirely. "The pods are leading us toward something, a destination that exists outside normal galactic geography, a place where the normal rules that govern matter and energy may not apply." The final transmission from the cartographer's dream contained observations that would never be officially recorded in Imperial archives, deemed too dangerous for preservation in any form that might allow their rediscovery. "I understand now why these two were cast into the void," Vash concluded, as reality itself began to break down around his vessel. "They represent possibilities that could not be allowed to develop, potential futures for humanity that would have led not to greatness, but to forms of transcendence that would have made the species incompatible with the universe as it currently exists. The Emperor did not lose them. He exiled them, ensuring that their influence could never shape humanity's development." The lost Primarchs continued their journey through the space between spaces, carrying with them knowledge and capabilities that could have reshaped the galaxy in ways that neither the Emperor nor the Chaos Gods could have controlled. They were not sons but forces of nature, not leaders but embodiments of principles that operated beyond the comprehension of lesser minds. In the void where they dwelt, time moved differently, and causality followed patterns that belonged to no known physics. They had become something more and less than their father had intended, perfect examples of what could happen when unlimited potential was allowed to develop without the constraints that made existence comprehensible. Their exile was not punishment but necessity, not loss but preservation of a galaxy that was not ready for the truths they had discovered in their solitude. They remained lost by choice as much as by chance, understanding that their return would bring changes that the universe was not prepared to accommodate. The void between stars had claimed them, but in return it had given them something that no world could have provided: the freedom to become whatever they chose to be, unconstrained by the expectations of lesser beings who would never understand the scope of what they had become. Chapter 10. What Might Have Been. In the private chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, where the Emperor conducted his most sensitive research, a single empty gestation pod remained as testament to the tragedy that had reshaped human destiny. The Master of Mankind stood before it for hours during those early years of the Great Crusade, his golden features marked by an expression that Malcador would later describe as the grief of a father who had lost children he had never had the chance to love. The Sigillite's private journal, discovered in stasis vaults sealed since the Horus Heresy, contains the only record of the conversations that took place in that chamber during the decades following the scattering. They speak of plans unmade, destinies unfulfilled, and the terrible weight of watching imperfection emerge from attempted perfection. He told me that each sun was intended to embody a specific aspect of human potential, Malcador wrote in the careful script he reserved for his most sensitive observations. Not just military capability or strategic thinking, but the full spectrum of what our species might become under ideal conditions. Together, they would have represented the culmination of human evolution, each one perfect in his particular sphere, while contributing to a greater perfection through their cooperation. The Emperor's original design had accounted for every variable he could perceive across the vast web of possibility that stretched into the future. Each Primarch was crafted not just as an individual weapon but as a component in a larger engine of transformation that would have elevated humanity to heights that even he could barely envision. The first pod was meant to hold the perfect strategist, a mind capable of analyzing any tactical situation and devising solutions that accounted for variables invisible to lesser intellects. On Caliban, the lion had become a great hunter and eventual master of his world, but the isolation and constant warfare against monsters had twisted his intended role into something darker and more paranoid. He should have been the architect of our greatest victories, the Emperor confided to Malcador during one of their midnight conversations. A mind that could see patterns across galactic scales, that could coordinate campaigns spanning centuries with the precision of a master chess player. Instead, he has become suspicious, secretive, unable to trust even those closest to him. Caliban taught him that enemies hide in every shadow, and now he sees betrayal where I intended cooperation. The sixth pod had been designed to carry the perfect warrior leader, one whose presence would inspire loyalty through deed rather than mere authority. Leman Russ had indeed become a king among the wolves of Fenris, but his development had emphasized savagery over nobility, pack loyalty over imperial vision. He was meant to embody humanity's capacity for noble sacrifice, the Emperor explained, his voice carrying harmonics of infinite sadness. To show others that true strength came not from domination but from protection of the weak. Instead, Fenris has made him into something that views civilization as weakness, that trusts only in the law of fang and claw. He leads through fear rather than inspiration, commands through strength rather than wisdom. The 12th pod's occupant had suffered perhaps the greatest deviation from intended purpose. Angron was designed to be the perfect liberator, one whose very presence would inspire the oppressed to throw off their chains and embrace freedom. Instead, Nuceria's gladiator pits had transformed him into an engine of rage that could inspire only violence. He should have been our greatest champion of justice, the Emperor said, his words heavy with the weight of opportunities lost forever. A being whose righteous anger could motivate entire populations to rise against tyranny. The butcher's nails have stolen that future from him, turning noble fury into mindless brutality. He fights now not for freedom, but for the simple pleasure of inflicting pain. Most tragic of all was the 17th pod's occupant. Lorgar had been intended as the perfect teacher, one who could inspire others to embrace the imperial truth through reason and wisdom rather than force. Instead, Colchis had turned him into something that sought truth in the worship of entities that existed beyond rational understanding. He was meant to be the prophet of reason, the Emperor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The one who would show humanity that gods were unnecessary, that truth could be found through science and logic rather than faith and superstition. Instead, he has become the most faithful of my sons, seeking divine purpose in realms that should be avoided rather than explored. The conversations chronicled in Malcador's journal reveal the depth of the Emperor's understanding regarding what had gone wrong. Each world that had shaped a Primarch had imposed limitations that constrained their intended development, forcing them into roles that served the local needs rather than galactic imperatives. I crafted them to be perfect, the Emperor explained during one particularly dark meditation, but I failed to account for the galaxy's capacity to corrupt perfection through necessity. Each world that raised one of my sons demanded specific adaptations for survival, and those adaptations became fundamental aspects of their character. They learned to be what their circumstances required rather than what I intended them to become. The empty pod served as a constant reminder of the most devastating loss. Not any specific son, but the cooperative synergy that should have emerged from their interaction. The Emperor had designed them to complement each other, each one's strengths compensating for the other's limitations, their combined capabilities exceeding the sum of their individual parts. They should have been symphonic, Malcador recorded after one particularly lengthy discussion. Each voice distinct but harmonious, each contribution unique but supportive of the greater composition. Instead, they have become instruments that cannot play together, each one attuned to different keys, their combined sound creating discord rather than harmony. The Great Crusade's progress only emphasized how far short reality had fallen from the Emperor's original vision. The Primarchs who were recovered proved capable of individual greatness, but their cooperation was marked by suspicion, rivalry, and fundamental disagreements about proper methods and priorities. Rogal's perfectionism conflicts with Perturabo's pragmatism, the Emperor observed as reports of interlegion tensions increased. Fulgrim's pursuit of beauty clashes with Ferris's focus on functionality. Guilliman's systematic approach frustrates Jagatai's preference for fluid adaptation. They work together when necessity demands it, but they do not trust each other, do not fully understand each other, do not love each other as brothers should. The two lost sons represented the most painful reminder of potential never realized. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs had been intended as the bridges between extremes, the moderating influences that would have helped their brothers find common ground despite their different approaches to leadership and warfare. One was designed to show them that victory without wisdom was meaningless, the Emperor explained to Malcador in the deepest hours of the night. The other was meant to demonstrate that knowledge without application was sterile. Together, they would have helped their brothers understand that greatness required both achievement and understanding, both action and contemplation. Their loss left gaps that the others cannot fill, absences that make cooperation infinitely more difficult. The Emperor's greatest regret was not the individual tragedies that had befallen his sons, but his own failure to anticipate the forces that would shape them. His foresight, vast as it was, had not extended to predicting how the Chaos Gods would use the scattering to ensure that each Primarch would develop in ways that served corruption rather than unity. I saw the threats that could destroy humanity, he admitted, but I failed to perceive the subtle influences that could corrupt it. The enemy did not need to kill my sons. They needed only to ensure that my sons would be shaped by experiences that made them incapable of fulfilling their intended purposes. Every world that raised one of them was chosen specifically to create flaws that would serve chaos rather than order. As the Great Crusade continued and the recovered Primarchs took their places as commanders of the legions, the Emperor began to understand that his original vision would never be realized. The sons he had intended as perfect instruments of human ascension had become flawed individuals whose very imperfections made them more human but less effective as components in his grand design. "They are not what I intended them to be," he concluded in one of his final conversations with Malcador on this subject. "But perhaps they are what humanity needs them to be. Perfect instruments would have served my vision, but imperfect sons can inspire others to transcend their own limitations. Their struggles give hope to those who see greatness as achievable despite personal flaws." The empty pod remained in its place of honor, a symbol not of failure but of possibility. It represented the futures that might have been, the paths not taken, the perfection that had been sacrificed for the sake of creating something more precious. Heroes who could inspire others not through their flawlessness, but through their determination to achieve greatness despite the imperfections that made them recognizably human. The scattering had stolen the Emperor's perfect sons, but it had given the galaxy something more valuable. Legends whose very struggles would inspire generations to believe that nobility could emerge from any circumstances, that heroism was not dependent on perfect design, but on the choice to serve purposes greater than individual survival. In the end, what might have been was perhaps less important than what actually was. 20 demigods whose flawed greatness would reshape the galaxy in ways that no perfect design could have achieved. Each one a reminder that humanity's greatest strength lay not in avoiding adversity, but in learning to transcend it. And so ends our chronicle of the day the Primarchs were lost, though their stories were only beginning. In the scattering, we see the eternal truth that perfection planned is often less valuable than greatness earned through struggle. The children who fell from the stars were not what their father intended them to be, but they became what the galaxy needed them to become. Flawed heroes whose very imperfections made their achievements all the more remarkable. Sleep well, wanderers, and remember, sometimes the greatest gifts come not from having everything go according to plan, but from learning to find purpose in the unexpected paths that life provides.